Welcome to my series of basketball videos where I'll be comparing various NBA greats against each other. I'm doing this because I find that a lot of the basketball videos comparing players on YouTube are too focused on the big names and sometimes compare players from different positions. Lots of people compare Jordan to LeBron and Kobe to Duncan, for example, due to their similar levels of achievements, but since those players play different positions and have different styles of play, it's not an interesting comparison. In this series, I want to do comparisons between not just more well-known players, but players from days past, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and the ABA as well, that most modern fans probably do not have too much knowledge about. Also, as much as possible, I want to compare players that play similar positions and/or similar play styles. To me, that's a more interesting and fruitful comparison. I'll be using 8 different metrics to judge each player. Scoring. This category will be defined by each player's career points per game, peak points per game, both regular season and playoffs, and number of scoring titles. Rebounding. This category will be defined by each player's career rebounds per game, peak rebounds per game, both regular season and playoffs, and number of rebounding titles. Passing. This category will be defined by each player's career assists per game, peak assists per game, both in regular season and playoffs, and number of assist titles. Efficiency advanced metrics. This category will be defined by each player's career true shooting percentage, PER, and win shares per 48. Reason I use true shooting percentage is because it's more fair to guards. Defense. This category will be defined by each player's all defensive selections, defensive win shares, and defensive player of the year awards. The reason I'm not using blocks, steals, or defensive box plus minus is because I want to compare the achievements of older players that modern fans might not have too much knowledge about, and players in the 1960s and early 1970s do not have these stats tracked. Awards. This category will be defined by all-star appearances, all-NBA selections, MVPs, finals MVPs, and championships as a top 3 player. The reason I have to count championships as a top 3 player on the team is because otherwise you'll get into the situation where, for example, Robert Horry has 7 rings and Karl Malone has 0, and it's not representative of how much better a player is if you weren't a top 3 player on that team contributing to a championship. Also, I'll be including ABA stats and awards and using them equivalent to their respective ABA stats and awards. Also, no All-NBA third team selections are included because All-NBA third teams weren't added until the late 1980s, which is unfair to older players. Playoffs. This category will be defined by how many Eastern Conference Finals or Western Conference Finals and Finals a player has been to, and how many championships they won as a top 3 player on the team. Yes, this is supplementary to the awards category because it also rewards players for making it far in the playoffs, even if they don't necessarily win at all. Totals. This category will be defined by longevity, how many total points, rebounds, assists, and win shares a player has accumulated throughout their career, and rewards a player's durability. After all, a lot of people say the best ability is availability. And of course, this is only going to be my opinion from comparing the available metrics, since I've not watched most of these players live or even been born when some of these players have been playing. And to keep it fair, I'm judging them based on how they did in their own era. There's no comparing what this NBA player played in today's era or the 1960s, none of that. It'll be strictly based on their stats and accomplishments within their own era against that era's competition, which makes the most sense to me. So I hope you guys enjoy this comparison video and hopefully learn something new from it. In the 33rd episode of the series, we take a look at 2 Hall of Fame small forwards who had all-time talent but whose primes were cut short by injury. Grant Hill had promising talent, a 6'8" small forward who played most of his prime for the Detroit Pistons, was able to handle the ball well, score, rebound, and distribute all at an elite level, until ankle injuries kept him from fulfilling that promise. Bernard King was an elite level scorer who played most of his prime for the New York Knicks, but just like Hill, injuries cut short his career and we weren't able to see the true extent of his abilities. Both players had short but statistically dominant primes, but who had the greater career? Let's find out. In the scoring category, although Hill was a very capable scorer, averaging 16.7 points per game for his career, peaking at 25.8 points per game in 2000, and 13.4 points per game for the playoffs, peaking at 23.6 points per game in 1997, King was on another level. King averaged 22.5 points per game for his career, leading the league in scoring with 32.9 points per game in 1985, and raised his average to 24.5 points per game for the playoffs, peaking at a ridiculous 34.8 points per game in 1984. Hill was a very good scorer, especially with his handles, able to drive in at will, and was his team's primary offensive weapon in his prime. However, King was an all-time scorer at his peak, and his 32.9 points per game stands as the highest scoring average of the 1980s by anyone not named Michael Jordan. Although he wasn't a three-point shooter and most players didn't care much about the three-point line in his era, he was absolutely deadly from the mid-range and the paint and was near unguardable in his prime. So although I respect Hill's scoring, this one will have to go to Bernard King. In the rebounding category, this one is fairly close. Hill averaged 6 rebounds a game for his career, peaking at 9.8 rebounds a game in 1996 and 6.1 rebounds a game for the playoffs, peaking at 7.3 rebounds a game in 1996. King averaged 5.8 rebounds a game for his career, peaking at 9.5 rebounds a game in 1978, and 4.3 rebounds a game in the playoffs, peaking at 6.2 boards a game in 1984. Both players were agile and athletic enough to corral decent rebounding numbers in their primes, and from the footage and numbers, it's hard to say that one was actually better than the other, so I'll have to call this category a tie. In the passing category, Hill had excellent court vision for his size, averaging 4.1 assists per game for his career, peaking at 7.3 assists per game in 1997, and 3.6 assists per game for the playoffs, peaking at 7.4 assists per game in 1999. King averaged 3.3 assists per game for his career, peaking at 4.6 assists per game in 1990 and 1991, and 2.3 assists per game in the playoffs, peaking at 3.5 assists per game in 1979. It's clear here that while King was an average passer for his size and position, Hill's playmaking and court vision in his prime draws comparisons to players like Scottie Pippen, Rick Barry, John Havlicek, and LeBron James. While his career assists per game numbers seem more pedestrian, Hill's playmaking in his Pistons prime is all-time for a small forward, rivaling that of his contemporary Scottie Pippen, effectively serving as a point forward of his team. Thus, this category will have to go to Grant Hill. In the efficiency and advanced metrics category, it's very close as both players are very efficient scorers and rarely took bad shots. Hill preferred to drive in and take high percentage shots, while King's ability to efficiently score in a variety of ways from the mid-range draws comparisons to his contemporaries Alex English and Adrian Dantley. Their advanced stats are pretty similar too, so I'll have to call this category a tie. In the defense category, neither player was known to be a great defender or even above average, but King was a particularly lackluster defender as most of his focus is on the offensive side, much like other 1980s scoring forwards Mike Aguirre, Dominique Wilkins, Kiki Vandeweghe, Alex English, and Adrian Dantley. Grant Hill, while not a defender that anybody would fear, at least did put some focus and effort in the defensive end sometimes, and this shows up in their win share difference. And yes, although Hill played slightly more games, he still has a sizable margin in defensive win shares. So I have to give this one to Grant Hill. In the awards category, neither player won a championship but had a number of All-Star and All-NBA selections. Although King has more All-NBA first-team selections, Hill has more All-NBA selections overall, and more All-Star appearances as well. Given that neither have any other notable awards, I'll have to give the slight edge in this category to Grant Hill. In the playoffs category, neither player has gone to the finals, although Grant Hill has reached one Western Conference Finals, albeit as a role player on the Phoenix Suns when he was past his prime. King never reached any finals or conference finals, but I do have to mention that King in the 1984 playoffs virtually carried the New York Knicks past the Isaiah Thomas Pistons and took the Larry Bird Big Three Celtics to 7 games in the second round with barely any supporting cast. That has to be mentioned and is his most notable feat in the playoffs, but I think this one is basically a tie because neither player really got very far during their primes. In the longevity category, while both players suffered injuries that effectively ended their primes prematurely, they still ended up playing a decent amount of games in total. Both Hill and King ended up with very respectable totals in points, rebounds, assists, and win shares. Although Hill has more than King in every category except for points, and also played 150 more games to boot. So I will have to give the edge to Grant Hill here. So when all the categories are summed up, Grant Hill takes the passing, defense, awards, and totals categories, while Bernard King takes the scoring category, with efficiency and playoffs being a tie, giving Grant Hill the decisive win. Grant Hill was a player that people saw as the next Elgin Baylor, the next Rick Barry, the next John Havlicek, heck, the next Larry Bird, a player who had all-around talent who did everything for the Pistons on the court. Alas, ankle injuries cut his prime short, but he still ended up having a reasonably productive career, especially with the Phoenix Suns in his twilight. Bernard King was also a player that a lot of people put hope in, especially New York Knicks fans. He was an all-time scorer who could single-handedly carry a team on offense, as we saw in the 1984 playoffs versus the Pistons and Celtics. Alas, he also suffered an injury right in the middle of his prime, and Knicks fans were robbed of a potential dynasty with a healthy King and upcoming Patrick Ewing together. These are two small forwards who ended up in the great what-if debates of NBA history. Hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next comparison video.